Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that thinks we should probably just stop having wars. That's not a joke, that's just my honest opinion, and I assume the opinion of the podcast. How are you, Rob?
I'm well, and yeah, I will stick my neck out here and agree with that controversial opinion that you've stated at the front.
I mean, it's we didn't talk about this in the preamble. We had a very nice kind of catch up because we haven't spoken in about a month and a bit. But which you can get if you sign up as a Patreon. But yes, like I've just finished listening to Ukraine Cast. I haven't yet had the brain space to also sign up for the new BBC podcast about the current conflict in Palestine and Gaza that we will talk about in a bit. It's just like, oh, can we stop having wars, please? I don't have much else to say on that topic, but I know we're going to kind of go into the depths of this maybe, but like, war bad. Not a controversial statement, I hope.
No, not at all. And yeah, like I've mentioned it, we can jump to the headlines now if you want to, because I think it's the big one.
Sure, let's go straight into the headlines, yeah. It's been, how was it, a week at this point?
Yes, yeah, I think it's like happened at the weekend, didn't it?
It was Saturday morning last week, so by the time this goes out, it will have been a week. I don't know what you specifically want to say here. We've just kind of we need to mention it, which obviously we do. Did you have any particular points?
Well, no, I think that it would be remiss of us to do this like, hey, we're a news podcast and here we are, and sort of like brush over it, because we are going to mention it in the latter part of it, particularly when we're talking about party conference season and the Labour Party conference, because what is usually a space where party conferences would have like equal billing or be on the front page of every news site at the same time. The war in the Middle East happened on the first day, pretty much, of the Labour Party conference. So, not the most important thing about the war, by the way, just to have it in front. But for us, for our point of view, it needs to be mentioned. So, yeah, there is a war in the Middle East at the moment, prompted by a terrorist attack by Hamas, who are from the Palestinian side, on a peace festival in Israel. And Israel has retaliated to quite the degree. What's happened today is that they've ordered 1.1 million people to evacuate northern Gaza in 24 hours, an act that has been condemned by the UN. And yeah, because it just sounds completely unreasonable to do that, and you fear for what's going to happen to that northern bit of the Gaza Strip. The war itself and the background and the history behind it is something that, well, I know I'm not remotely qualified to talk about it. I don't think there are many people who could give you a definitive history of the entire event. It is one of the sort of like most long-standing and like messiest conflicts in history, or ones particularly to understand. So I didn't want to touch on it in any way, that shape or form, to discuss, how and why it started, other than the sort of the triggering event and the response. So I guess the way you started the podcast by saying war bad, yeah, war very bad, and it seems at the moment the actions from both sides at the moment seem to be ratcheted up to such a level that it is hard to comprehend. And as you said, the fact we've already got one war podcast, the Ukrainian war, that's been going on for over a year now, quite easily. In fact, we might have to add one of those. Is just we'll have to see what happens as it goes on in the background, but I don't think it's going to calm down anytime soon, given what's going on at the moment.
No, I think, as you say, there's a lot of history involved. I haven't studied it. I have a passing knowledge. I think most people are aware of some of it. But yeah, like you say, I'm unsure if I tried to say anything, with a bit of thought, I would inevitably stick my foot in it, saying something, because someone would be like, "Oh, that's not right." So I'm very aware that the war is happening and that there's a lot of animosity on both sides for many reasons. Like you say, it's a sticky and difficult thing to talk about. There's a reason people have always said it's hard to talk about. Like my entire lifetime, it's been like, "Oh, this is tricky." There are better sources to go listen to than ourselves, so seek those out. I'll try and find a few. I think there are a few good episodes of various news podcasts that I've listened to in the last week that have touched on various parts of it.
It is hard to talk about because without the full, it feels so unqualified to talk about it. As in, it's like asking me for my opinion on nuclear physics. I know Big Bomb go boom at the end of it. I've watched Oppenheimer, but that's my knowledge of nuclear physics. I can't do an explainer podcast for you. So yeah, if you want to go and seek out more information on that stuff, it's a big event. It's going to be happening probably for a while. And if, it's something like the Ukrainian war that's going on in the background, we might not be the best podcast to cover that event, but I just wanted to make sure that we got it out there and with knowledge of it, because it will affect our politics and our politicians in other ways, in the way they address that, and we will be mentioning it later on in the podcast as well.
The kind of point I stumbled over while I was trying to explain that is that we appreciate there's a lot of history to it, and so that's probably why, it's not going to be over next week, unless something unprecedented happens. It's the kind of thing where that both sides have so much skin in the game, it's just going to continue. In a similar way to, like, if when Ukraine wasn't immediately wiped out by Russia, they were like, we're going to keep, this is our country, we're not leaving. And Russia kind of presumably assumed that it would be a walkover, and it wasn't. And here we are 18 months later. So hope. I would love there to be peace tomorrow, but I don't think that's going to happen. After saying all of that, we're moving on to our main story, which, as you say, seems to pale in comparison, but something we're more qualified to talk about and definitely can give opinions on. Party conference season. What's been going on there, Rob?
Yeah, so I'm going to focus on the main two, if it's okay with Conservatives and Labour. I know that other parties do have their conferences at this time of the season. The Lib Dems had one before this, but unfortunately I think the most entertaining or notable thing that came out of that is that Ed Davey called Conservatives clowns. And when he was asked to apologise, he said, "I'm very sorry, I used the wrong C word to describe Conservatives." Insert your own joke there. But so to give a little bit of just context to this, they happen every year, and this is widely seen by most as probably the last one before the general election. Now, it might not be. Our last general election was in December 2019, which means that we have to have one by December 2024, so there would be time for another round. However, Andrew Marr has sort of predicted that he thinks the next general election will be in the spring of 2024. And, well, who am I to disagree with the great Andrew Marr? But I do understand his reasons for giving that. Most probably it's because the December election we had in 2019 was weird. Like, do you remember it was kind of like Christmassy and Boris Johnson did that weird Love Actually spoof?
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that bit. But yeah, it was pre-COVID, which is kind of this weird, it was just pre-COVID. And as you've put in the notes here, Brexit was like this most important thing. And Boris Johnson's government was seemingly on the ropes. It had almost been brought down several times by various shenanigans in Parliament. And he was like, fine, I'm calling a general election. And we were all like, oh yeah, a chance to get Boris out, but it didn't quite go that way.
Yes.
When I say I mean members of the podcast, not the entire British public, because based on how they voted at that election, we were not necessarily aligned.
No, well, that was the thing, wasn't it? It's made a nonsense of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, really, that was meant to make sure that we just had one. It was the conditions for triggering a general election were higher. The governing party can't just say we need one, the entire Parliament needs to vote on it. But back in 2019, nobody's not going to vote for a general election because it looks like you're backing down and you're scared. So Parliament was so dysfunctional at that point, particularly when it came to getting a Brexit deal through, that Boris Johnson basically threw his cards on the table and said, look, we need a definitive answer to this Brexit question. Either I'm going to lead it or Jeremy Corbyn's going to lead it. Hence all of his talk of oven-ready Brexit deals. And when he was elected in on December, I want to say the 13th? I believe it was December the 13th, only because I got my cat on that day and I remember it being Friday the 13th. So I think that would make sense.
All I know is I had to drive back from Amsterdam that day, which was fun.
Yeah.
Gosh, I have a photo I sent. Yeah, so I left Amsterdam at like lunchtime, and the latest you can vote is 10 o'clock, despite being in a very safe Lib Dem seat. I was like, it was kind of the fun of like, oh, I've got to get home anyway. And I, have photos of the company car and on the Eurotunnel and things like that. And I only just made it, actually, because there was a lot of traffic outside of Amsterdam, which really kind of scuppered my plans. But yes, I have a strong memory of that election for that reason.
Yeah. But yeah, so those are the circumstances of the 2019 election. Nobody thinks that like Rishi Sunak's particularly wanting to repeat that. So it's likely that the date of the next election will be brought forward slightly, and that'll be April. So this is the chances for all of the, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer to lay out their stalls. It's not a manifesto per se, but it is your last chance to sort of rile up the party faithful and put a few ideas out there into the world that don't come through Prime Minister's questions or something like that. It's a chance for particularly the opposition to give their message completely unencumbered from the other side firing back at them immediately. So Lib Dems go first. And like I said, there's passes. I haven't done much research on that. We can skip over this bit in the podcast. But yeah, then it's the Conservative Party conference. So, do you remember?
It's one of the big ones.
It is the big one. Well, it's the chance for like the Prime Minister to have his say. And weirdly, like usually in this sort of cycle, after 13 years of Conservative government, you would expect the Prime Minister just to come out and say, aren't we doing a really good job? The Conservatives have been in power for so long. Yay for me. Keep on voting to keep this ship a-rolling. Weirdly, of course, it is Rishi Sunak's first Conservative Party conference, because last year, Liz Truss was the one in charge. Do you remember that at all, and the atmosphere surrounding Liz Truss at the time?
This was just after she'd kind of messed things up with the economy, right? And she was kind of like, yeah, no, it'll be fine. I'll definitely be here next week. And she made it, 9 days or something. I think it was one of the few promises she managed to keep.
Yeah, it was bizarre. So, like, Rishi Sunak, basically, he has a very low bar to pass, as with everything post Liz Truss. It's a very low bar to try and pass your predecessor in that factor, but in that facet. But last year, she'd just done the round of disastrous local radio interviews where she didn't appear to be very competent. On the eve of the conference, people were discussing which bits of her economic plan she was going to tweak. And she kind of said, no, I'm not going to change anything. And then things sort of like leaked out day by day through the conference what she was going to change. She had high governing members like Michael Gove in full rebellion talking on Laura Kuenssberg's show about why Liz Truss's ideas were bad and why he didn't support them. So it was quite chaotic last year. And there was a sense of sort of like misery and resignation around the conference that they were going to lose the next general election. And conversely, on the Labour side, all of a sudden they felt, wow, now is our time. It's not going to be a general election soon, but we need to start making something better. This time around, I think that the aim from Rishi Sunak's part of the party, at least, was to dismiss that sort of negative vibes that there were from last year, try and rile up the troops and say, yep, I still believe that the Conservatives can win. However, I would say that also on the fringes, and maybe not so fringes, from some currently serving cabinet members, there were speeches or things said that suggested that they more had their eye not on the next 5 years in government, but if they were going to be the next Conservative Party leader in 1 to 2 years' time. So there were there was the Conservative Party conference, if we do speak about it longer than the Labour one, it's because they've got sort of like a more interesting psychodrama happening around them at the moment. There's really interesting things, and there's kind of, I felt it was a fight for the party's future in a way, or which direction that they're going to go in.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I've had discussions with people recently about how the Conservative Party don't seem to be the Conservative Party anymore, and I think that's what you're alluding to. That where are they going in the future? Well, the whole point of the Conservative Party, they're meant to be stability, sensible governance. Like that's all the stuff they say, but now they seem to have gone very kind of more like Republican US in that they're very culture wars, like all these things. That there were problems that we've mentioned before. This kind of seems like similar back to kind of the Major era, but the kind of the level of I feel like the scandals and stuff were a bit different back then. Now it seems like anything is on the cards. I'm worried for what damage they can do before the next general election, because it seems like they keep doing ridiculous things, some of which I'm sure we'll touch on in a minute, even without Liz Truss, because the whole thing was like, oh, now we're going to have someone sensible instead of Truss. And then stuff keeps coming out where you talk to the average person and they're like, what? And I'm sure we'll touch on things like HS2 and everything else. But yeah, it's very... a very strange time. And you listen to people, there were some people interviewed on Newscast about, SPADs, so these kind of special advisors to government who are like pro-conservative, they're not ministers, and it honestly like kind of sounds like they're sat there with like someone off to the side being like, poking them with a stick, like read this message saying, oh, the Conservatives are going to do so well. It's like, who are you fooling? Like, we're all seeing the poll, like, I know we've talked about polls being wrong before, but it does feel like the writing is very much on the wall after 13 years, and they keep trying to be, oh, we're the new party. I'm like, you've been here for 13 years. You can't spin that. And I think like all of the kind of coverage I've seen of it is like, I mean, outside of newspapers that are on site, but even then, some of the newspapers that normally support the Conservatives seem to be turning on them. So it is very much that turning point.
Yes. And it's super interesting for like all those reasons that you stated. One of the people who I think is loudest in maybe not her criticism of Rishi Sunak directly, but in how she's setting out how she would lead a Conservative Party, is Suella Braverman, who is kind of like, I hate kind of like just putting the two of these people in the same box, but just for the layperson, it's like Priti Patel, but how could you make her worse somehow? Like, how could you put a Home Secretary in who appears to be more hardline? It's her. She's been, for me anyway, like a weirdly significant figure in government in recent times.
Well, she was put in charge of this whole stop the boats policy, essentially, because that was one of Sunak's pledges for reasons. And then that has been a cavalcade of errors, I would say, based on what I've seen.
Yeah, she's done that. Before that, she was Justice Secretary, I believe, under Boris Johnson. And because she had a history in like law, and all I heard from lawyers at the time were like, goodness me, I know lawyers. She's a very bad one. Sure, she qualified, but why on earth, if you think that's a qualification for her to take this job, she's not very good at it. Her performance as like a cabinet minister doing the basic functions, and when I've seen her in the Houses of Parliament, the current shadow Home Secretary, the current shadow Home Secretary is Yvette Cooper. So a lot of the time, those two will rub up against each other in Parliament and have to do counter speeches to another. Yvette Cooper eats Suella Braverman for breakfast every time she gets up to the stand. So I think she's one of those people where it could be Liz Truss 2.0, as in she's speaking to the crowd and telling the Conservative Party what they want to hear and what the Conservative ultras want to hear. But I think the rest of the party, and maybe when she comes under a bigger spotlight, when she has to do more traditional kind of prime ministerial things, that would be where it all falls down if she were to rise even higher in the party. But to bring it back to what we were talking about, sort of like within the context of the Tory party conference, her speech was one of the ones which was the most alt-right, culture warsy type things that you said. Like, the Conservative Party of David Cameron or even Theresa May would not have said the things that she said. I think most notably, she talked of a hurricane of migration coming into the UK, which is sort of like, we've had people like, I think it's Nigel Farage or Katie Hopkins talking of like a swarm of people coming into the country, very negative based language around migrants coming in. Sort of, you had people comparing her speech to Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, which is a historically quite like racist speech that was done by a maverick conservative politician back in the 50s and 60s. So to have her compared to that, you can see what vibes we're getting from her. And the other thing that she was talking about within her speech, she spoke about fighting back against gender ideology. And there was a conservative in the audience who let me see if I can grab his name because I was there. Andrew Boff, who was in the audience, who's muttered under his breath, saying there's no such thing as gender ideology. And he was hauled out of that party conference room as quick, like he was a Just Stop Oil protester, I feel. And that was one of the Conservatives' own people on the floor talking against it. So if you want an idea of how there are two sides of the Conservative Party and where not all of them support this kind of culture war side, I think a lot of it was summed up within Suella Braverman's speech that she did there.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like you mentioned Enoch Powell, who famous racist. I think no qualification needed. Famous racist, not controversial. There was some footage of like young conservatives, this kind of baffling group that exists. I've never understood. And there's there was this like interview, I think, with some young conservatives, and they were kind of like mentioning kind of talking points along his. I'd have to try and dig out the video. I saw it in passing, but it's like that should not be the rhetoric coming out from a main party. Like there was this whole thing where at some point in the past, the BNP, who are a big racist party, who now have gone under, were stealing the Conservatives' lunch, and that's kind of led to so many problems we've had where we've ended up with like Brexit. I feel all of that kind of draws from that kind of, there's a very right-wing vocal faction, and I feel like all that's happened in the last 13 years is that has been encouraged, and as we've seen, like similar to the US where things have kind of diverged. So, there's very left and very right and not much in the middle. It very much feels like that's the kind of way that with all this culture war stuff they're trying to stoke, and especially the kind of things Suella Braverman was saying in her speech. Like I can't put it in words. Here's a weird noise. Yeah. I've spoken with a few friends who may have voted Conservative in the past, and when I say in the past, like quite a while ago, and they're all kind of like, what is this party? Like they don't recognize it because they were like, oh, I voted for fiscal responsibility or something, like, and we can have long discussions about whether that was actually true based on the track record of Labour and the Tories in the past, but that was kind of a reasonable position to take, maybe. Whereas now it feels like voting Conservative is not a reasonable position to take, to me. Like it feels like there's no way you can justify it because they don't tick any of the boxes you'd want. They're not, they're not strong and stable. They're not like there's this whole list of things. It's like, surely no one can be watching this and believing what they're saying. I mean, obviously some people must. It's not going to be 100% Labour votes in the next election for many reasons, but you look at it and you're just like, how is this a real party? It's hard for me to understand.
It is, but you had I will touch on the reasons why they're going down this route later on when I talk about Sunak's speech, because they're essentially trying to build an electoral coalition, like some way they can get above 20-25% of votes, because under Liz Truss they were getting 12%, right? So they're trying to claw some of those people back so they're not completely wiped off the map next time. But if you want an explanation of, who are these people talking to, they're talking to the people who watch GB News, right? They're talking to the people who have bought into that culture war stuff that was stoked in 2015, then in 2019 by Boris Johnson, and is now continuing to being stoked into the point where these people didn't have a voice in the mainstream media for those point of views and those opinions. Now they have an entire cable news channel essentially devoted to that, where they can I watched the newscast as well. They stole this from the Financial Times, but they said that GB News is basically an outrage machine. It's a way of generating permanent outrage at the general world and how it's going, and if you buy into that, then the Conservatives want you to vote for their party because they're branding themselves in that way at the moment. The other person who was there as part of the GB News staff was Nigel Farage, and there were lots of pictures at him at events in various speeches. There was an infamous video of him and Priti Patel dancing at the Conservative Party conference, which if you haven't seen it, if you've got a sensitive stomach, please, I would advise you don't eat anything before seeing it. It's a very odd interaction between the two. But yeah, they said that he was drawing, he draws crowds. He's drawing people there. And even though he was only at the conference in his role as a sort of member of the media, I'm doing bunny ears, you can't see it. The fact that lots of people at that conference were swarming around him and not swarming around Jeremy Hunt, let's say, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, that gives you an idea, I think, of the direction that some within the Conservative Party want to go. And it would be, it's my bet that if the Conservatives lose the next election, which they probably will, there'll be a lot of people who will make the mistake, in my opinion, of deciding to double down on going as right as possible. And my warning for Conservatives about that would be that Labour tried that with Jeremy Corbyn. You know, they'd lost a lot of elections being in the centre, and they said, we're going to go as far left as possible. And that didn't, it nearly worked in one election under a very strict set of circumstances. But when I keep talking about this, when you look back at that 2017 election against Theresa May, it went as worse as possible for Theresa May, but she still didn't come anywhere close to being the smallest party in Parliament because Jeremy Corbyn's politics didn't build a coalition for the entire country. And I do fear for the Conservative Party that if they decide to double down in that direction, then they won't build a coalition. They'll have a very strong identity and they'll have some people who very strongly support them. But I don't see how they get an election-winning coalition from that group of people.
Yeah, and I'd like to hope that the average person is more central than where they seem to be standing right now. Like I said, I think the Conservatives should lose the next general election. I don't think that would be surprising. I think that's what we're on track for. We'll talk about the polls later. But it does worry you that, you know, you're going to have it, you look over at America and you kind of have this 50-50 split of the people who actually vote. And it's like the policies are kind of, you know, they've stagnated into this very left, very right. And you want there to be some change and a chance for, you hope that doesn't become the Conservative Party just stuck in this completely right-wing aspect, because otherwise they're going to win at some point and have those policies, which I don't want. Yeah. So, you mentioned Nigel Farage. Do you want to talk, do you think he's got a chance of, you know, he was kind of a fringe politician. He came in during Brexit, but now is there a chance he could go mainstream? I'm sure he's said, oh no, I never possibly would, but he's said that so many times and then hung around that I don't believe him.
Well, it's almost like Nigel Farage, when Brexit was in full swing, like after Cameron left, for example, politics, and probably after Theresa May left, if you wanted to say that, the wing of the Conservative Party that was the most Brexity was the Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg group, right? And if Nigel Farage had been a Conservative politician, he would have been in that group and would have had a position of power, right? The problem is that he was such an outsider, he created his own political party and couldn't get into the Conservatives at that time. Donald Trump was a complete outsider, but decided to run as a Republican because their system was different. He was able to come in and take it over, even if not every senator or every person on the floor agreed with him. He was suddenly president. So that's why it was difficult for Nigel Farage to do that transition immediately. Now, probably enough time has passed that if he wanted to join the Conservatives, they would consider it, and if they saw it as an electoral asset, maybe he would. Obviously, he's not going to run as a Conservative politician before the next election in 2024. But hey, maybe after that, maybe there's an opening for him to come in or be a political advisor if the party. I think the caveat for him is that he would want to be in charge of it all. You know,
yes,
he doesn't want to be a backbencher. He doesn't want just a cabinet position. He would want a very significant position of power. And he is, you know, the joke was that he's won a lot of times being an MEP, which is under a different voting system than what we use in our general elections. In first past the post, even at UKIP's height back in 2015, he did not win the seat that he stood in that he thought was the best chance for. You know, UKIP never had a single MP within the Houses of Parliament, but they were still able to influence politics for an entire generation of people. He had to come at it from a different angle. So to see him to go into more conventional politics would shake it up as well a lot. So he was there. The other person I wanted to just touch on briefly was Penny Mordaunt, who is kind of representing the other side of the Conservative Party, I feel, and the other person who is throwing her hat in the ring to be the next leader. So you might remember her that she ran in the contest against Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak first time round, didn't make it to the final two. Then in the mad scramble to see who would take over the mantle of Liz Truss, she was unable to get the right amount of parliamentarians behind her. It looked like it was just going to be a two-horse race between Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson until Boris Johnson stood aside. So she's a big player within the Conservative Party. I think the general public more widely known as the lady who held the big sword at the coronation.
Yes. I was going to mention that because I'm sure you've seen the Room Next Door sketch about her speech, where
Yes.
that is mentioned. It's like,
Yes.
oh, you can't just go on because you held a big sword. I imagine you're getting into this. I've seen her speech, and like Suella Braverman, as you said, was very culture warsy, very. I mean, I would say it was bad, but it's like not necessarily that the rhetoric was bad, but the point of the speech was bad. Like it was a well-written speech to get us across what a set of opinions I disagree with. Whereas I feel like from what I've seen of Penny Mordaunt's speech, I didn't watch the whole thing, but I've seen enough of it. It didn't feel like a great speech. It felt a bit lackluster. She kept repeating "stand up and fight," which who fight who?
Yes,
like,
she was.
It was kind of like the point being made was it wasn't just a bad point. There was the rhetoric was missing. I felt, and that's down to speech. I know that most ministers don't write their own speeches, but yeah, it did feel weird.
She tried to say sort of stand up and fight to these Conservative members, but tried to cut out the more culture warsy style of things. Her point of view was kind of like, oh, we're Conservatives and we've always stood up for what's good and right and what's proper. You know, a strong economy. We've been there when, you know, we've helped Ukraine during the wars. We're this, you know, we are Britain through and through. However, us Conservative politicians get a lot of stick from everybody. You've had your party offices graffitied. You've been bullied. Essentially trying to paint the Conservatives as these poor little underappreciated underdogs, you know, despite 13 years of power. And we'll get into this because it's the type of thing that people seem to forget. But still, after 13 years of Conservative power, she's trying to present them as the scrappy underdogs who everybody hates, but we'll fight on nonetheless and get through. So that is like, it was interesting to see her put that pitch as Conservative leader. Like, you are plucky underdogs. And boy, I think after the next general election, they're about to be the underdogs. So they'll need to have people who are willing, as she said, to stand up and fight for the Conservative, sort of like the soul of the Conservative Party, traditional conservatism. I felt that was kind of, despite the delivery of her speech, which was odd and obviously easily ridiculed, there is something in there as well that suggests that she's like, right, if the Conservative Party in a way has walked its way over these 13 years from being the party of David Cameron, who was kind of like Tony Blair, but what if conservative, like more conservative, to the party of like Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, which is definitely edging right and right and right. Penny Mordaunt might be just standing up and saying, oi, if you in the party don't stop and fight for what Conservative values have always been, we will lose that, and we will lose this party to the people, like Suella Braverman, like Nigel Farage, etc. So that's the sort of inner turmoil of the Conservative Party on those sort of like sub-speeches that are the little preps before we have the main event of the PM.
Just to clarify before we move on to the PM, are you saying she's asking them to fight for their right to Conservative Party?
Yes.
Because honestly, that line I've just come up with is better than a whole speech.
It is, and I think you've just found your podcast title. So yeah. No, I'd be 100% behind that.
Anyway, so moving on into Sunak's speech, do we want to talk about, before we actually touch on the stuff in the speech, do you want to talk about the rumours? There was a big rumour mill in the run-up to this, because some things leaked.
Oh, what, from HS2 and the like?
Yeah, I touched on it earlier, but like the whole, like, it was at least a week of people going, are they going to scrap HS2? Sounds like they're going to scrap HS2. It'd be really bad if they scrapped HS2, especially when they're holding a conference in Manchester, the place HS2 is meant to go to. They wouldn't possibly scrap HS2, would they? I feel like just that preamble is required for what we're about to discuss, but I don't know if you wanted to touch on the rumour mill and how that was bad for Sunak in general. It seemed, at least to me as a outside observer. Yeah,
it sounds like the type of thing. I was talking earlier, right, about how usually when you are like, even as leader of a political party, the Prime Minister gets more opportunities, of course, to sort of give their agenda without somebody having a go at them right back, right? Because they can go in front of a big building, have a podium, talk to the people and run away behind that big black door, right? So he usually gets a chance to control the agenda. In a perfect world, Rishi Sunak would never have mentioned HS2 in Manchester. As you said before, the optics are terrible, right? Do not scrap HS2 if you're doing a party conference in Manchester. The whole reason the party conference is in Manchester is because the Conservatives want to try and present an image of themselves where they are part of the Red Wall, right? I can't remember the last time that Manchester returned a Conservative MP. There's probably maybe one or two on the outskirts.
There are bits of Manchester that are more conservative, but as a general rule, in the same way that London is generally Labour voting on the whole, it's a similar. Like Manchester has more than one MP, but yeah, I mean, I think they've always had a Labour mayor, although maybe that's just because the mayor is fairly new. But as far as I'm aware, yeah. Like when I lived in Manchester, it was a very Labour place in a time when a lot of the country was voting Conservative.
Yeah, precisely. So it's really bad if you go to your conference and the main talking point is how they are going to stop a piece of technology that was meant to revolutionise transport and be a connection for the north and help bring wealth out of London to the north, which has been a huge talking point for consecutive Conservative governments now. I think particularly like Boris Johnson's plan of like levelling up. There is this sort of undertone within Conservative speech, I think even from the days of Cameron, that Labour focused too much money in the cities. We want to make sure that the wealth gets out there, particularly to those in the north. That's one of the reasons maybe you could argue why they were able to persuade so many voters in those red walls in 2019 to come over to the Conservative Party. So the fact that this leaked, I believe it was a result of like long-range photography on a piece of paper that the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt was taking out of a meeting, and it had HS2 on it, and people were like, well, why are they talking about HS2? Why is the Chancellor thinking about HS2 particularly? Because that's all about money. It just led to this sort of like steady drip, drip, drip of people asking, are you going to scrap HS2? What's going on with it? Very bad optics for them, obviously, and tricky for Rishi Sunak to negotiate. I can't remember how long it was denied until kind of like on the eve of the speech, suddenly they were like, yeah, it's definitely happening.
I think officially speaking, they didn't announce it until the speech, but it was just obvious the night before. Like there was enough momentum behind the story that people were like, yeah, it's definitely getting scrapped tomorrow. I think there may have been a second leak, I forget. But it was very like, are they going to do? And like, you know, the political podcasts in the lead up to that were like, oh, maybe this is a shrewd move to like get people worried. And then he says, actually, you know, HS2 is going ahead fine. And everyone's like, yeah, but no, that wasn't the plan. So it was a bad plan and it continued to be a bad plan. There was no like sudden beneficial reveal. Well, I mean, they tried to claim they were going to take the money from it and spend it on all these things, but then it transpired about a day later that all of those things were ideas.
Yes, and it's bizarre. I think the premise of the way they tried to spin it, like you said, is that, oh no, like this money has been tied up in this project for far too long. It's a relic of a former Conservative government, and weren't those guys awful? But now I'm new and exciting. The new exciting Rishi Sunak will correct the mistakes of Conservative governments past, and we will put this money to better use in more efficient projects across the north. That was the way they tried to spin it. As for how convincing they were, I think that it's, I don't think many sort of like newspapers, I think some tried to spin it as a good thing. They tried to follow the party line, but this is going to be a really hard one for people to swallow, particularly when I think the Labour attack lines write themselves, right? On this one. HS2 seems to have been a project that is so far down the line now that to scrap it so late in the day, it feels to me like a chancellor saying, oi, we need 36 billion real quick back into our coffers. We could just get rid of this and it would help plaster over the cracks for a while.
Yeah. I think maybe we're going to have to dive into the, like, I appreciate we've got to run through his speech and also get onto Labour. I think it's just worth mentioning here that like it feels like this is also maybe an attempt to set up Labour, because if they're going to lose the next general election, they've kind of basically said that this land that was bought can be sold. So for people who aren't aware, obviously, if you're running a train line where one doesn't exist, you're going to have to build a train line. That's going to go through property. And so a lot of this was compulsory purchased. So that means people have, the government buys it. They say, you have to sell it to us. And they buy it at what is probably below the market rate. There is like a term in there where it's meant to be like the going rate for the property. But in all honesty, it's probably less than you'd get if you sold it privately on your own terms and not because the government says so. The problem with, because of the way they've scrapped it, they've basically said, yep, it's scrapped now. And this property can be sold again, which means if Labour were wanting to continue with HS2, when they get back in, they've kind of been screwed out of that opportunity because land would have to be recompulsory purchased, which was already a big problem for voters in various areas where the HS2 was running. So it's like, I do wonder if they're trying to set up a trap for Labour because they're like, oh, you're going to have to take this mess off our hands that we've made. And also we get to look like our budget's better. I was reading it in a very kind of conniving way, but also I wouldn't put it past them at this stage if they know they're not going to make it to through the next general election.
Yes, and maybe that's kind of like sums up this speech in its entirety, where usually things in this speech would be taken seriously as government plans for the next 5 years. The long-term thinking behind this speech, it must be noted, like how many of these things are actually going to happen. One of which we'll move on to, the smoking ban. So I don't know if you've read much into this, but it is essentially, I believe they've done it in New Zealand as well. So the idea is copied from there. You ban the sales of cigarettes for everybody aged 14 or lower. And then the next year, you ban cigarettes for everybody 15 and lower. So, of course, the people who are 14 are now 15 and still can't buy cigarettes. And you keep raising the age until, I don't know, 120? I don't know when that ends.
To be clear, that currently you can't buy cigarettes if you're under 18. So it's more that if they brought in this rule, this rolling increase they're suggesting, that someone who is 14 now would never have the legal opportunity to buy a cigarette. And also part of the benefit that, like, when it went, so a personal story on this, like I was there when smoking died. No, with rapturous applause. I was the year that smoking got banned in pubs, and I think because it was the same year or the year before, I was also the year where I, as a 16-year-old, could legally buy cigarettes, but the kids below me couldn't buy it until they're 18. Like, it went up with me. I never smoked, so this wasn't I didn't really care, but I was aware this was a thing. When I was at uni, some 16-year-olds asked me, an 18-year-old, to buy them some cigarettes, and I was just like, no. But there is that kind of like chancer aspect. I know it definitely happened with people with alcohol at the same time. You know, when you, like, alcohol has always been like a hard 18, but you can drink it in pubs with your parents. So, you know, you definitely get that kind of, like, the 18-year-old might bring some alcohol to a party, and people are like, ooh, you know, those kind of things happen. And the other idea with this is, like, it gets more and more ridiculous for someone to either pretend to be 18 and maybe get away with it because they've got a dodgy ID, but also, you know, when it gets to the point where you've done this for enough years, the person, like, buying, the skeevy person helping buy cigarettes for the younger person is so far away in age from them that it becomes ridiculous and, like, not possible is one of the ideas behind it. I don't think it's a bad policy. It's just kind of like, you know, if I was the Labour, I'd just be like, yeah, when we come in, we'll keep that.
Yes, but what makes it so odd to me is that is it a traditional Conservative policy? No,
it doesn't.
If this was put in under New Labour, the Conservatives would be having a go at it for being incredibly nanny state, right? Oh, how dare the government tell me if I can or can't smoke? The weird thing about this one is, of course, and I think the loophole that Rishi Sunak is trying to find is that, oh, no, don't worry, it doesn't affect old people. You can keep smoking all you want. It'll only affect those 14 or under, and they can't even vote anyway, so who cares? So it's kind of, I think that's how he's trying to play it, spin it. I don't know. But as a sort of one of the key foundations of conservatism, as far as I understand, is that the state stays out of the affairs of people in a kind of like a libertarian-esque way. It's not, in my mind, a particularly conservative policy. So, yeah, one of the more odd ones to come out of that speech, and definitely worth talking about. But I do wonder where it fits. You know, those people watching GB News that we were talking about, those people that the Conservative Party are trying to attract, I'm not quite sure if this one will be a vote winner for them.
No, I mean, I think yeah, like I say, I think it's kind of a sensible policy. I can see why you're saying it's not particularly conservative policy as well. Yeah, if I was Labour and I was writing my manifesto, I'd just be like, yeah, we're not going to stop that. That's a good idea. Like, if asked any questions, you wouldn't make it. You'd be like, yeah, we agree with that. We'd just do it, and then that takes any power out of the Conservatives saying they're going to do it because, oh, well, Labour will do it too. Cool. So next up, probably one for which I'm sure your wife might have some strong words on, or anyone who's been involved in the teaching qualification, in the teaching industry at any point, like my mother, revamping school qualifications yet again to give it a stupider name. Feels like we do this every few years, and then occasionally they revert them to O levels and A levels, and we sound a bit like Harry Potter, and then we move back to some weird name. So what's going on here? It feels like a rebrand more than a revamp to me, but I didn't read all the detail.
Yeah, so I think the basic proposal is that there are A levels, which most people take, and then there are T levels, which are like tech levels, I believe. You get rid of that distinction, you merge them all into one compulsory post-16 educational tool called the New Advanced British Standard Qualification, which sounds very fancy, very conservative.
Snappy title.
Yes, it's very snappy. It's one of those things where I look at this policy and who does it speak to? Who is it a big vote winner for? I think this is kind of like one of Sunak's pet projects. Sunak talked a lot about education in his time in charge. Remember when he was all about maths? And, he
was like, everyone needs to know maths. And it's like, well, yes, to an extent, but they need to know real life maths, not integration.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think most people, if you said, hey, would it be useful at school if people learned how to do taxes and things like that so that they're prepared for the adult life? People would say yes. But if you say, do you need to know how to integrate and differentiate? Not unless you're doing engineering and physics, really. So, yeah.
But you can believe that those words come out of Rishi Sunak's mouth, right? Because he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. He's a nerd. You can't think of Boris Johnson saying, we're going to reinvigorate maths.
No, Boris Johnson might be like, bring back Latin.
Bring back Latin and French oral would be Boris Johnson's proposal. But yeah, it would be... it's those kind of... It was this kind of thing where I went, oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess you can do that. You're not going to be able to get it done in time for the next general election, definitely. So I kind of feel this is never going to happen. They've got... It came out of left field for me. And again, I just, like the maths comment, I spoke about it at the time, I just don't think this is a vote winner. If anything, I think it runs the risk of confusing people. If I was a voter with a family and I've got a teenager saying, oh, am I going to have to sit something else now? Really? What is it? No, don't worry. But it does feel like they're kind of shaking up the education system for what I can see, no discernible reason.
Yeah, especially putting in something that a compulsory thing for above 16 when, like, don't get me wrong, I think if people can be given good education for longer, that's great. But, people currently only have to be educated up to 16. People who are going into a vocational job can go straight into a job like that at that point and not go to university. That should be a viable option for the people who want to do it, I feel. And suddenly changing that, like you say, it's going to be like, oh, but I was going to become a mechanic next year and now I can't. Probably isn't going to be a big vote winner. It's the kind of thing you'd pull in the middle of your term if you're the government and be like, hopefully everyone's forgotten about it by the next general election.
Yes. Bizarre policy. And finally, now this is, so I think
I'm prepared to laugh. I've seen the notes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got a guffaw already. Come on.
So what Rishi Sunak is trying to sell to you with a straight face is that after 13 years of Conservative government, dismiss all of that, forget the previous 12 years, forget everybody from Cameron to Truss. Rishi Sunak, will lead the Conservative Party, the true party of change, and change is what the country needs.
Oh, I can't believe you said that in a straight face. I would point people to, I quite enjoyed Newscast on this, where they were kind of like that. They had an interview, as I say, with like some conservative spad who was like, yeah, he's definitely, look at him, he's so young and cool and interesting, and he's not Keir Starmer. And it's like, I don't think that's winning right now, particularly because, as you say, they've been there for 13 years. Most people can see through such a a suggestion that he be the candidate of change. But then I really enjoyed the BBC trying to be as unbiased as possible, reporting on these facts while also being like, he's not the candidate of change. He's been there for 13 years. It was kind of interesting to listen to. Do you think that's going to work with the general public?
So I don't know. I hope it doesn't. But the reaction of the general public to other things, me and them don't necessarily see eye to eye on all matters. But I do think most of them, based on current polling, won't buy that argument. I can see what he's trying to do and why he has to say it, though. So, like the election, if you are a Conservative electioneer, a Dominic Cummings, right? The traditional way that you try and win elections, as is standard, is that usually you have a party of we're in charge, we've been doing a great job, look at our record speaks for itself, vote for us again. The Conservatives are not in that position at the moment. We've talked lots about the problems that the country has and the turmoil. Rishi Sunak, I don't think, can say that proposal with a straight face. So the other proposal he has to go for is that I am the candidate of change. And oddly enough, maybe that's one where he can spin it because of the dysfunction that we've had within the Conservative Party from 13 years ago. So we spoke about it earlier, the way the Conservative Party has slowly moved more right, not out of government, but in government. And that's very strange because usually when you have long periods of people in power, like Thatcher or Blair, you have an ism, right? You have Thatcherism, Blairism. You know what those policies mean when you think of them in their minds. You've got an idea of the government that they presented. What the Conservatives have had for the past 13 years is they had Cameronism, but they had it in a coalition to begin with, so it wasn't true Cameronism. Then he got power, but then halfway through his political term, Brexit happened, so he had to give it up. So you got Theresa May in, but she was hamstrung by Brexit and didn't actually have a majority, and she was ousted by Johnson, and then Johnsonism was different, and Johnsonism was going to last for 1,000 years until it didn't. And then you had Trussism, which moved it even more to the right, but messed up within a month and a bit. So now we've got Rishi. So Rishi can look back. There's no consistent method of Conservative thought, right? So he can say, look at all those bozos who came before me. None of their ideas lasted because they weren't bold enough or brave enough to do what needed to be done. Vote for me, the radical Rishi Sunak, and I will, bring you into the sunlit uplands, and that's my policy for the next few years. His argument that might work as well is the fact that he says, look at Labour. Labour are just new Labour again, which is the politics of 30 years ago. If you vote for them, you're just going to get more of the same. We tried New Labourism under Cameron, and look where that got us. No, if you want real change, vote for the Conservatives. So that's his pitch. Is it going to work better than we're the Conservatives who've been in power for 13 years and we've done a great job? Probably, because I think lots of people would argue that they didn't like the Conservative policies of the last 13 years. But I think he's been the cards that Rishi Sunak has to play in his hand now. He's got a 2 of diamonds and a 4 of clubs. Like, you can't do anything with them.
High fours. Yeah, no, I mean, I think your analysis has been pretty good. I don't have much to add, but yeah, I think he's fighting a losing battle. We'll get on into the bowls at the end. So if you're looking at your podcast clock, you might realise we've spoken about this for a long while, and we still have Labour to get to. So if you're hearing me talking now, we've decided to cut this into 2 episodes. So you're going to get your next episode much quicker than usual, but allows you to kind of digest this and move on. So the next one will be Labour and the polls. Although I think you've probably got a fair idea of where the polls are from how we've been speaking about this. You know where to find us in all the usual places. You can find us at parliamentary.observer, our website domain that I still can't believe they let me have. You can find us on patreon.com/TTSS, where you can throw $1 our way in order to get access to that Patreon bonus episode that we record every time, where Rob and I talk about video games, life, other things outside of politics, if that interests you. And you can find us on, it's called X, but I'm going to call it Twitter, Instagram, and on Reddit. Just search for us on Parliamentary Language or Unpol Podcast in various places. And also they'll be linked on every podcast episode and on the side of the website. Very easy to find. I guess we'll just kind of weirdly do goodbye right now, and then we'll record the rest of this episode. So there's nothing else for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
Bye.
Listen to the next podcast for the real change.
Yeah. Bye, except not bye, because Rob's still here and I'm going to record another hour of talking once I have got another drink.